Hello, my name is Keith and I am the Woke Pastor. I am here to share my theology and how it informs and forms our lives. Hello, friends. I have 5 reasons for you to consider contacting your congressman to set term limits. I ask you to call or write your congressional delegates in support of an amendment to the Constitution of the United States to limit the number of terms that a member of Congress may serve. Resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives to the United States of America in Congress assembled, 2/3 of each house occurring therein, that the following article is proposed as amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states within 7 years after the date of its submission for ratification. Section 1. No person who has served 3 terms as a representative shall be eligible for election to the House of Representatives. For purposes of this section, the election of a person to fill a vacancy in the House of Representatives shall be included as one term in determining the number of terms that such person has served as a representative if the person fills the vacancy for more than 1 year. Section 2. No person who has served 2 terms as a senator shall be eligible for election or appointment to the Senate. For purposes of this section, the election or appointment of a person to fill a vacancy in the Senate shall be included as one term in determining the number of terms that each person has served as a senator if the person fills the vacancy for more than 3 years. Section 3. No term beginning before the date of the ratification of this article shall be considered in determining eligibility for election or appointment under this article. So here's the overview. Legislative proposals for congressional term limits date back to 1789. Supporters generally argue that requiring frequent turnover among members of Congress would make the House and Senate more responsive to and representative of their constituents. Opponents counter that elections serve as a de facto term limits at voter discretion and that experienced members of Congress are required to ensure that elected officials, rather than congressional or agency staff or lobbyists, make policy decisions. In Congress, at the U.S. Supreme Court, and in the states, the 1990s featured substantial term limits activity. Members of Congress continue to propose congressional term limits, a change that the Supreme Court in U.S. Term Limits Inc. v. Thornton, 1995, held would require an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. This CRS in Focus provides a brief overview of policy and legal issues concerning term limits for members of Congress. It does not discuss term limits for congressional committee chairs or leadership positions. The joint resolutions in the 118th Congress would limit eligibility to serve in the House of Representatives to 3 or 6 terms, counting as one term an election to fulfill a vacancy if the representative served for more than 1 year. Similarly, the proposals would restrict eligibility to serve in the Senate to 2 terms, counting as one term an election or appointment to fulfill a vacancy if the senator served for more than 3 years. Most proposals would not include terms that begin before the date of the amendment's ratification. The U.S. Constitution establishes the qualifications for senators and representatives. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 3 requires senators to be at least 30 years old, 9 years a U.S. citizen, and an inhabitant of the state from which the senator is elected. In a parallel provision, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 2 requires representatives to be at least 25 years old, 7 years a U.S. citizen, and an inhabitant of the state from which the representative is elected. Moreover, Article 1, Section 5, Clause 1 provides that each House of Congress has the express authority to be the final judge of the elections, returns, and qualifications of its members. In U.S. Term Limits Inc. v. Thornton, the Supreme Court determined that its decision in Powell established 2 principles. First, that the framers intended the qualifications for Congress provided for in the Constitution to be exclusive, and second, that the first principle is buttressed by the proposition that in U.S. representative democracy, the people should choose whom they please to govern them. Building on those principles, the court in Thornton invalidated the Arkansas constitutional provision that, among other things, established congressional term limits. Specifically, the state constitutional provision prohibited the name of a person from appearing on the ballot for election to the U.S. House of Representatives if the person had been elected to 3 or more terms, or for election to the U.S. Senate if the person had been elected to 2 or more terms. Examining the U.S. Constitution's history and text, along with congressional and state practices, the court in Thornton concluded that the Constitution does not provide the states with the authority to prescribe qualifications for Congress. According to the court, allowing the states to establish congressional term limits would affect a fundamental change in the constitutional framework. Such change, the court emphasized, must come not by legislation adopted either by Congress or by an individual state, but rather through amendment procedures set forth in Article 5. In view of the court's precedents, it appears that a constitutional amendment to the U.S. Constitution would be necessary to establish congressional term limits. Based on the case law discussed, a federal statute establishing term limits for members of the House and Senate would likely be held unconstitutional. As noted, proposed constitutional amendments have been introduced in recent Congresses. Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution sets forth 2 methods for amending the document. First, either 2/3 of both chambers of Congress or conventions in 2/3 of the states may propose amendments, and the proposed amendment is subject to ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures or by conventions and 3/4 of the states respectively. So these are my 5 reasons to establish term limits. State term limits experiences provide context for some congressional proposals. According to the National Conference of State Legislatures, 15 states currently limit state legislative terms. These limits vary significantly. Current state legislatures' term limits vary between 6 and 12 years. Some states cap lifetime legislative service. Others reset the term limit clock after a break in service or election to another chamber. Some states also exempt incumbents who held office when term limits were adopted. The second reason, public opinion. Public opinion appears to be a major factor affecting the continuing policy debate over term limits. Frustration with Americans' political system has led to some renewed interest in setting term limits for lawmakers, although it's an idea broadly opposed by experts. Voters have long been supportive of hard caps on how long someone can be in office, but recent infighting among Republicans over who should be Speaker of the U.S. House and health issues among aging members of Congress have reignited calls for federal term limits. Ethics scandals at the U.S. Supreme Court have led to separate calls for judicial term limits. Congress is one of the most unpopular institutions that we have, and so when we have something unpopular, it makes a lot of sense to refresh the people who serve in that institution. The idea has, over the years, been proposed by Democratic and Republican candidates alike, even then President Donald Trump. The third reason is the incumbency advantage. The stories of lawmakers staying in office despite scandals and ethic violations exist, and the blame of this is on the power of incumbency. 97% of incumbents get reelected. From a democracy standpoint, from an election standpoint, our elections are not very democratic. There are multiple factors that make it easier for incumbents to win elections, including redistricting. Most members of Congress are in uncompetitive seats drawn to particularly favor their party. Over 90% of our elections are uncompetitive, meaning we know essentially what party is going to win those elections no matter what candidates are running. And so the faster you turn these politicians over, the more you're going to have to replace them. Term limits don't solve the core problems in American politics that make people dislike Congress. Things like gerrymandering, political organization, and the influence of special interests, as well as money in politics. All of those other factors are included, but setting term limits is at least a step in the right direction. The fourth reason is institutional knowledge. Lawmakers use the excuse that setting term limits affects institutional knowledge, but lawmakers aren't spending their time in gaining institutional knowledge. Even when they have an unlimited amount of time in office, there's evidence that members of Congress spend most of their time raising money for their reelection. They're not studying the issues. They're not reading 1,000-page bills because they're focused on getting reelected. They're so focused on keeping the job rather than doing the job. If politicians knew they had a limited time in office, they would spend more time working for their constituents instead of focusing on their next election. And the fifth reason is the power of special interests. Some academics have found evidence that term limits give special interests more influence because lobbyists and legislative staff have the bulk of the institutional knowledge in state legislatures. Term limits do not equate to a big win for lobbyists and special interests. Lobbyists are some of the biggest opponents to these efforts. Lobbyists don't go to the congressional doors and say, I need your help to get term limits. It doesn't happen. The fact that there is still a debate about whether Congress should have term limits just shows the outsized influence that politicians have, because we don't debate other 87% issues. We don't debate whether, like, my town should have a park or whether we should have, like, regular trash pickup. Other 87 to 90% issues. We say that we just say this is what the American people want. This is what we're going to do. But term limits are imposed so strongly by the permanent political class in Washington, and in the end, it is largely up to members of Congress to impose those limits on themselves. A 1995 U.S. Supreme Court ruling went further to say that even if members of Congress managed to impose term limits on themselves, it would be ruled unconstitutional. That means congressional term limits might have to pass through a constitutional amendment, which is an exceedingly more difficult hurdle to clear. So, I ask you to contact your congressman and ask them to consider the bill to limit the terms of our congressmen in the House and in the Senate.